You are standing in a museum room in Seville, in front of a glass case holding 21 pieces of gold. A necklace, heavy with pendants shaped like stylized flowers. 2 thick bracelets. 2 curved gold plaques shaped, unmistakably, like the hide of an ox stretched out flat. 16 more plaques stamped with lotus flowers and rosettes, glowing under the case lights the way gold glows nowhere else. This is the treasure of El Caramelo, 21 kilograms of worked gold pulled out of a hillside outside Seville in 1958 by construction workers who were not looking for treasure at all, they were leveling ground for a pigeon-shooting club. And for the better part of a century, historians have argued about who made it, who wore it, and what it has to do with a kingdom that ancient Greek and Phoenician writers described with something close to awe, and that then, sometime around 2,500 years ago, simply stopped existing in any form anyone could point to on a map. That kingdom was called Tartessos. If the name is unfamiliar to you, you are in good company. It is unfamiliar to most people, even most people who consider themselves reasonably well-read in ancient history. And yet the ancient Greeks who actually encountered it did not treat it as a footnote. They wrote about it the way a modern trader might write about a legendary market at the edge of the known world, a place of almost supernatural wealth, ruled by a king who lived to an age that strained belief, sitting at the mouth of a river so rich in silver that, according to one much-repeated ancient claim, arriving sailors could not find enough silver-poor cargo to carry it all home and had to melt down their anchors to make room. Some scholars think this same kingdom is hiding, under a slightly different name, inside the pages of the Bible, a distant western port called Tarshish, mentioned some 25 times in Hebrew scripture, the place Jonah tried to flee to when he was told to go to Nineveh instead, the source of the silver and gold that flowed into Solomon's temple on ships that took 3 years to complete a single round trip. And then, across a span of decades in the 5th century BCE, it goes almost completely silent. No siege is recorded. No conquering army marches in. No single ancient author sits down and explains, in the way ancient authors usually do explain the fall of famous kingdoms, exactly what happened to Tartessos. It just stops appearing in the record, as though someone reached out and quietly erased an entry from an atlas, and for roughly 2,000 years afterward, nobody could agree on where, or even whether, it had actually been. Let this settle for a moment, because it is the strangest part of the whole story. Rome fell, and we have libraries of commentary on why. Egypt's new kingdom crumbled, and archaeologists can trace the drought years in tree rings and stalagmites. But Tartessos, a kingdom wealthy enough that Greek historians name-checked its king by name and treated its silver as a kind of local legend, seems to have simply faded out of the historical record while its own contemporaries were still alive to notice. Somewhere in the marshes and river deltas of southern Spain, an entire sophisticated culture built cities, minted no coins but moved staggering quantities of precious metal, worshipped gods we can only partially reconstruct, and developed a writing system that nobody today can fully read. And then it disappeared so thoroughly that a 19th and 20th century archaeologist spent years of his working life convinced that Tartessos and the lost city of Atlantis were, in fact, the very same place. Let's go back to where this kingdom actually stood, follow the trail of silver and gold and half-legendary kings that made it famous across the ancient Mediterranean, and then follow the much colder trail of ash and sealed pits that modern archaeologists have only recently begun uncovering, a trail that might, finally, be starting to explain how a kingdom this celebrated managed to vanish so completely. Tartessos sat, as best modern archaeology can reconstruct it, in the far southwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula, roughly where the modern Spanish region of Andalusia meets the Atlantic, centered on the lower reaches of the Guadalquivir River. In antiquity this river mouth looked nothing like it does today. Where the coastline now runs in a fairly clean line, ancient Tartessos sat on the edge of a broad, shallow, brackish lagoon system, something closer to a shifting network of marshes, tidal channels, and low islands than a conventional river delta, fed by the Guadalquivir on one side and open to the Atlantic on the other. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of geography that swallows evidence whole, soft sediment, shifting water, centuries of silt burying whatever came before, which is one honest, unglamorous reason Tartessos proved so difficult to relocate later. But in the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BCE, this marshy frontier was not a backwater. It was one of the richest metal-producing regions anywhere in the ancient world, and everyone in the eastern Mediterranean who dealt in metal seems to have known it. The wealth came from geology as much as from any particular cleverness on the part of the people who lived there, though cleverness certainly helped. The mountains inland from the Guadalquivir, the Sierra Morena to the north and the mining districts further west, in what is now the Spanish-Portuguese border region, held some of the richest deposits of silver, copper, and, crucially, tin anywhere accessible to Bronze and early Iron Age traders. Tin mattered enormously, because tin is what you need, mixed with copper, to make bronze, and tin sources were notoriously scarce and scattered across the ancient world, a genuine bottleneck resource, the kind of thing entire trade networks organized themselves around. A region that could reliably supply both tin and silver in quantity was not simply wealthy. It was strategically indispensable, in exactly the way that oil-producing regions are indispensable today, and the people who controlled the flow of that metal out of the Iberian interior and down the Guadalquivir to the coast held a genuine chokehold on ancient Mediterranean trade. Word of this wealth reached the Phoenicians first, sometime around the 9th or 8th century BCE, sailing west from cities like Tyre and Sidon along the North African coast in search of exactly this kind of opportunity. They founded trading posts along the southern Spanish coast. Gator, modern Cadiz, is generally considered among the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe, founded specifically to service this metal trade, and through those posts, Tartessian silver and tin began flowing east into the broader Mediterranean economy in quantities substantial enough to show up, indirectly, in the archaeological record of Phoenician cities thousands of kilometers away. The people the Phoenicians were trading with were not, it's worth stressing, a primitive or peripheral culture being exploited by more sophisticated outsiders. The archaeological picture that has slowly emerged over the last few decades shows an indigenous Iron Age Iberian culture that was already organizing itself into something resembling small kingdoms or chiefdoms, with its own religious architecture, its own metalworking traditions predating serious Phoenician contact, and, this is the detail that continues to fascinate linguists, its own writing system, found on roughly 100 surviving inscriptions across southern Portugal and southwestern Spain, using a semi-syllabic script unrelated to Phoenician or Greek letters. It is, by most estimates, among the oldest indigenous writing systems in Western Europe. And to this day, nobody has managed to translate it. Scholars can transliterate the symbols into approximate sounds with reasonable confidence. What those sounds actually mean, as connected language rather than isolated names, remains essentially unknown, because the underlying Tartessian language belongs to no clearly identified family and left no bilingual inscription behind to serve as a key. If Tartessos had only ever been known to us through Phoenician trade goods and an undeciphered script, it might have remained a specialist's footnote. What elevated it into something closer to legend was a specific, remarkable moment of contact with the Greeks, and specifically, with one particular king, whose name has survived across 25 centuries attached to a single, staggering claim about how long he ruled. Sometime around the middle of the 7th century BCE, a group of Greek traders from the city of Phocaea, on the coast of Asia Minor in what is now western Turkey, undertook one of the longest and most ambitious sea voyages attempted by Greeks up to that point, sailing not simply across the familiar waters of the Aegean, but the full length of the Mediterranean and out through the narrow strait that Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, into the open Atlantic, toward a kingdom they had heard about only through second-hand report. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 2 centuries later, one particular Greek sea captain, a man named Kaleos, sailing from the island of Samos rather than Phocaea itself, was blown badly off course during a voyage originally intended for Egypt, and ended up, by what Herodotus describes almost as pure accident, arriving at Tartessos before any other Greek trader had managed to reach it. What he found there, and what happened next, became one of the most quoted anecdotes about wealth in all of surviving Greek literature. The king of Tartessos at that time, according to Herodotus, was a man named Arganthonios, and the trading relationship he struck with these arriving Greeks was strikingly, almost suspiciously generous. Herodotus records that Kaleos and his crew sailed home from Tartessos having made a profit larger than any Greek trading voyage of that era on record, a single trip so lucrative it was still being talked about, apparently, generations later. And Arganthonios himself, according to the same account, became so fond of the Phocaean Greeks who subsequently established regular trade with his kingdom that he invited them to abandon their home city in Asia Minor entirely and resettle permanently within his own territory in Spain, an offer the Phocaeans politely declined, though when their home city later came under threat from the expanding Persian Empire, Arganthonios reportedly offered them money to help fortify their walls against the coming siege, an act of foreign aid across roughly 3,000 kilometers of Mediterranean coastline, extended by a king to people he had known for what was, even by generous estimate, only a matter of years. But it is the length of that king's reign that has made Arganthonios genuinely famous. In the specific, slightly uncomfortable way legendary details tend to become famous even when nobody is quite sure whether to believe them. Herodotus states plainly that Arganthonios ruled Tartessos for 80 years, and that he lived, in total, to the age of 120. Later ancient authors, apparently unsatisfied with even that already extraordinary figure, pushed the number higher still. One later source claims Arganthonios lived a full 150 years. Modern historians treat these numbers with the same skepticism you would probably bring to them yourself. Either the figures are simply legendary exaggeration, the kind of larger-than-life detail that accretes naturally around any sufficiently famous and prosperous ruler in oral tradition, or, as several scholars have proposed, Arganthonios may not refer to a single individual at all, but functioned more like a dynastic title or throne name, passed down through a line of successive kings at Tartessos, each one folded together in later retelling into a single impossibly long-lived figure. Either way, the softer, more verifiable truth underneath the legend is this: for a sustained stretch of decades in the mid to late 7th century BCE, Tartessos was ruled by a stable, wealthy, outward-looking monarchy, confident and secure enough to welcome foreign traders with open arms, wealthy enough to be remembered specifically for its generosity rather than merely its riches, and famous enough, across a genuine cultural and linguistic divide, that a Greek historian writing in Ionia 200 years later still knew the king's name. This is a good point to pause, because if a story like this, a half-legendary king, a kingdom so wealthy it became a byword, a mystery that swallowed an entire civilization whole, is the kind of thing that pulls you in, this channel exists for exactly that feeling. New episodes on lost cities, vanished kingdoms, and unsolved archaeological mysteries go up regularly, so if you would like more evenings spent drifting through stories like this one, this is a good moment to hit subscribe before we go further into the silt and the gold. Tartessos' fame did not stop with Greek historians. A separate, older, and considerably more debated thread of evidence connects Tartessos to a name that appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible, Tarshish. The word shows up roughly 25 times across the Hebrew scriptures, almost always attached to two ideas: enormous, seaworthy trading vessels known as ships of Tarshish, and a source of imported wealth, particularly silver, gold, and exotic goods, associated with the far western edge of the known world. In the Book of Kings, Solomon is described as maintaining a fleet of these ships, undertaking round trips that took 3 full years and returned laden with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Later, the prophet Jonah, ordered by God to travel east to Nineveh and warn its people of coming judgment, instead books passage on a ship bound for Tarshish, fleeing, the text implies, in precisely the opposite direction, toward the furthest and most remote destination a person of his era could plausibly imagine escaping to. Since at least the 16th and 17th centuries, various scholars have proposed identifying this biblical Tarshish with Tartessos in southern Spain, pointing to the phonetic closeness of the names across Semitic and Greek transliteration, and to the simple logic that a genuinely far western source of silver, described in almost identical superlative terms by both Hebrew and Greek sources within a few centuries of each other, is more plausibly one real place described twice than two. Separate legendary places that happen to sound alike and specialize in exactly the same commodity. It is not a universally accepted identification. Other candidates have been proposed over the centuries, including sites in North Africa, Sardinia, and even, in a few older and now largely abandoned theories, locations near the Red Sea, on the reasoning that a 3-year round trip from the Levant sounds implausible for a destination as far as Spain. But the Tartessos identification remains, among specialists in ancient Near Eastern trade, one of the more seriously considered options, not because any single piece of evidence proves it beyond doubt, but because so many smaller details, the silver wealth, the distance, the maritime character of the trade, the west of everything geography, line up more cleanly with southern Spain than with any of the alternatives. If the identification holds, it means that this same kingdom, ruled by the same long-lived king who charmed Greek sailors, may also be sitting, half disguised under a slightly different name, inside one of the most widely read texts in human history, quietly funding, from the far edge of the known world, the treasury of a biblical king thousands of kilometers to the east. For most of the modern era, none of this, not Herodotus, not the biblical references, not the scattered mentions in later Roman geographers, was enough to actually locate Tartessos on the ground. And the person whose name is most closely, and most awkwardly, associated with the search is a German archaeologist named Adolf Schulten, who spent a significant portion of his career, beginning in the early 20th century, convinced not merely that Tartessos could be found, but that Tartessos and the legendary lost city of Atlantis, as described by Plato, were one and the same place. Schulten conducted genuine, methodical excavations in the marshlands of the Guadalquivir Delta, in the area around the modern town of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, hunting specifically for a sunken or buried city he believed matched Plato's description closely enough to justify the comparison. He never found it. His Atlantis theory has been almost entirely set aside by mainstream archaeology today. Plato's Atlantis is now generally understood by most classicists as a philosophical thought experiment rather than a garbled memory of a real place, but Schulten's underlying instinct, that something real and substantial was buried somewhere in that river delta, was not wrong. He was simply looking with the wrong theory and, as it turned out, in roughly the wrong specific spots, decades before the archaeological techniques that would eventually crack the problem had even been invented. The first genuinely solid physical evidence arrived almost by accident, and not from Schulten's marshes at all, but from a hillside just outside Seville. In September 1958, workers preparing ground for a private shooting club on a low rise called El Carambulo uncovered the gold hoard now on permanent display in Seville's archaeological museum: the necklace, the bracelets, the ox-hide-shaped pectorals, the 16 stamped plaques, 21 pieces in total, worked with a level of goldsmithing skill that immediately raised difficult questions about who, exactly, had made them. For decades after its discovery, the Carambulo treasure was debated primarily as a question of authorship. Was this the product of a genuinely sophisticated indigenous Tartessian culture, using techniques of its own, or was it essentially Phoenician workmanship, made by colonizing craftsmen and merely found on Tartessian soil, evidence less of a wealthy local kingdom than of a wealthy foreign trading post planted on top of one? It took modern geochemical analysis, techniques Schulten could not have dreamed of, examining the specific isotopic signature of the gold itself, to finally settle a meaningful part of that argument in the 21st century, confirming that the gold was locally sourced from Iberian deposits, worked using techniques that blend both indigenous and Phoenician traditions in ways that suggest a genuinely mixed, cosmopolitan culture at Tartessos, rather than a simple story of one side making everything and the other side merely owning it. The Carambulo treasure gave Tartessos a face, of sorts, proof of craftsmanship, wealth, and cultural sophistication concentrated in a single glittering find. But it took further decades, and a series of excavations scattered across the Spanish region of Extremadura, well north of the Guadalquivir's marshy mouth, to begin revealing what the actual architecture, religion, and daily life of this culture had looked like. The most important of these sites, discovered in 1978 near the town of Zalamea de la Serena, is called Cancho Roano, the best-preserved Tartessian building anywhere in the archaeological record, and one of the strangest. Cancho Roano was not a single structure but three, built one on top of the other across successive generations, each new building erected directly over the deliberately buried remains of the one before it. The final and best-preserved version, known to archaeologists simply as Cancho Roano A, was a square, tower-like building oriented precisely toward the sunrise, surrounded by a moat that appears to have been kept permanently filled with water, a genuinely unusual architectural choice, more reminiscent, in some ways, of religious architecture found much further east in the Mediterranean than of anything typically associated with the western Iberian interior. Inside, archaeologists found two ritual altars, hearths, and evidence of careful, repeated ceremonial use spanning generations. And then, sometime no later than around 370 BCE, the building met an end that was neither accidental nor the result of enemy attack, but something far more deliberate and, frankly, harder to interpret. It was burned. Deliberately, thoroughly burned, and then, while the ash and rubble were still warm, or close to it, sealed beneath a fresh layer of packed clay, in a ritual pattern that archaeologists have compared to similar deliberate destruction practices documented among the Etruscans, far to the east in Italy. Animal remains found buried within the sealed layers suggest a final round of sacrifice and ritual feasting accompanied this closing act, as though the building was not so much destroyed as formally, ceremonially retired, put to rest, with full ritual honors, by the very people who had built and used it. If Cancho Roano felt like an isolated, strange anomaly when it was first excavated in the late 1970s, a second site, discovered decades later and only 50 or so kilometers away, made it look less like an anomaly and more like a pattern. Casas del Turuñuelo, near the town of Guarina in Extremadura, has been under active, ongoing excavation since 2015, led by a Spanish research team, and nearly every excavation season since has produced findings genuinely rare enough to make international archaeological news. In 2023, a team of researchers published a detailed study of the site's central courtyard, where they had recovered and painstakingly analyzed the skeletal remains of 52 animals, primarily mature horses, along with cattle, pigs, and a single dog, totaling nearly 7,000 individual bones. Radiocarbon dating and careful taphonomic analysis showed the sacrifices had occurred across 3 distinct phases spanning several years, the earliest leaving skeletons essentially intact and undisturbed, the latest showing clear signs of butchery and processing, suggesting a ritual meal accompanied the final phase of sacrifice before the entire building, like Cancho Roano before it, was deliberately burned and buried beneath a sealed layer of earth. And then, in April of 2023, the same excavation team announced something that immediately reframed everything else found at the site. Buried in a sealed pit beneath the temple floor, mixed in among the animal remains, they found 5 carved stone busts, human faces, damaged but in 2 cases remarkably well preserved, dating to the 5th century BCE. Before this discovery, virtually everything known about Tartessian religious imagery pointed toward the abstract: animals, plants, geometric and floral motifs, no confirmed human portraiture of any kind attributed with confidence to Tartessian culture itself. These 5 faces changed that in a single excavation season. 2 of the busts appear to depict women, their features carefully rendered, wearing what may represent gold earrings carved directly into the stone, quite possibly, researchers suggested, images of goddesses, given their careful, deliberate placement within a clearly ritual context. For a culture whose religious life had previously been reconstructed almost entirely through indirect evidence, altars, sacrificed animals, imported luxury goods, the undeciphered fragments of an unreadable script, 5 actual human faces, carved by Tartessian hands roughly 2,500 years ago and hidden deliberately from view until a Spanish excavation team's trowels reached them, is about as close as archaeology gets to a kingdom looking directly back at you. What makes Cancho Roano and Casas del Turuñuelo together so significant to the larger mystery of Tartessos is not simply that they are rich, well-preserved sites. Plenty of ancient sites are rich and well-preserved without changing the fundamental story of a civilization's collapse. It's the specific, repeated pattern of deliberate, ritualized destruction found at both locations, separated by decades in construction date but showing strikingly similar behavior at the moment of ending: burning, animal sacrifice, ceremonial sealing beneath clay, and then permanent abandonment, at multiple sites, within a relatively compressed window of the 5th and early 4th centuries BCE. This is not the archaeological signature of conquest. There are no arrowheads embedded in walls, no scattered skeletons of defenders cut down where they stood, none of the blunt force evidence that usually accompanies a city destroyed by an invading army. It looks, instead, like something closer to a culture that chose, in a formal, ritualized, and apparently coordinated way, to close certain sacred buildings for good, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question that current archaeology has not fully answered: was this ritual closure a response to some other, external catastrophe already underway, a kind of formal mourning for a wealth and stability that was visibly disappearing for entirely separate reasons? Or was the burning and sealing itself, somehow, connected to the deeper cause of Tartessos's broader decline, rather than merely a symptom of it? The honest answer, at the level of hard archaeological consensus, is that nobody currently knows for certain, and several competing explanations remain seriously debated rather than settled. One line of argument points to shifting trade patterns. As Carthage rose to dominate Western Mediterranean commerce through the 5th century BCE, gradually displacing the older Phoenician trading network that had originally connected Tartessos to the wider Mediterranean economy. The kingdom may simply have lost its most important commercial lifeline. The steady flow of Phoenician ships and Phoenician demand for Iberian silver that had underwritten its wealth for centuries. Cut off from its principal foreign market, the argument goes, the elite structures that depended on that wealth, the kings, the temple economies, the long-distance luxury goods that show up so prominently in sites like El Carambolo, could have unraveled from simple economic exhaustion, a slower and less dramatic collapse than a war, but no less final. A second line of argument looks instead to the landscape itself. Geological and sedimentary studies of the lower Guadalquivir suggest the shallow lagoon system on which Tartessian coastal settlement depended was itself changing significantly during this period, silting up, shifting channels, gradually transforming the marshy, boat-accessible geography that had made trade so easy into something more difficult to navigate and settle, an environmental drift, not unlike the slow subsidence that eventually swallowed Thonis Heraclean in Egypt, capable of quietly strangling a river-mouth economy over the course of a few generations without any single dramatic event marking the moment of collapse. A third, and increasingly favored, interpretation treats the deliberate burning of sites like Cancho, Roano and Casas del Turuñuelo not as evidence of catastrophe at all, but as evidence of a genuine, internally driven cultural and political transformation, a shift in how power and religion were organized across the region. Perhaps the deliberate end of one particular form of sacred kingship or elite ritual practice, giving way to newer, less centralized forms of settlement that simply left a fainter, harder to recognize archaeological signature than the monumental temple palaces that came before them. Under this reading, Tartessos did not so much collapse as quietly transform into something that stopped looking, to later observers and even to modern archaeologists working from old assumptions, like the same civilization at all. What almost certainly is not true, despite roughly a century of romantic speculation, is that Tartessos was swallowed whole in some single sudden catastrophe, a flood, an earthquake, an Atlantis-style vanishing beneath the waves in a single terrible night. The archaeological record, patchy as it still is, shows something slower and stranger, elite burials tapering off, monumental construction ceasing, luxury imports growing rarer across the 5th century BCE, while at the same time, in sites like Casas del Turuñuelo, people were still actively building, still conducting elaborate multi-year ritual programs, still carving human faces into stone with genuine skill, right up until the specific, deliberate moment they chose to burn the building down and seal it shut. It reads less like a civilization caught by surprise, and more like one that saw an ending coming, in whatever form that ending actually took, and met it with ceremony rather than panic. For roughly 2,000 years after that ending, whatever its true cause, almost nobody could say with confidence where Tartessos had actually stood, or separate the handful of surviving facts about it from the layers of legend, biblical speculation, and outright fantasy that had grown up around its name in the long absence of physical evidence. It survived only as fragments, a king's name in Herodotus, a handful of tantalizingly parallel references buried in Hebrew scripture, a scholar convinced he had found Atlantis in a Spanish marsh and never quite proving it. Then, across barely more than half a century, a construction worker's shovel outside Seville in 1958, a chance discovery near Zalamea de la Serena in 1978, and a still ongoing excavation at Casas del Turuñuelo that keeps producing new finds almost every season since 2015. Tartessos went from a half-mythical name in old books to a culture with actual gold you can stand in front of, actual buildings you can walk the moat around, and, as of a handful of years ago, actual carved human faces. Looking back out of the ground after 25 centuries of darkness. We still cannot read the Tartessian language written on those southwestern inscriptions. We still do not know, with any real certainty, what those 5 carved faces from Casas del Turuñuelo were meant to represent, or what words were spoken over them in the moments before the pit that held them was sealed. We do not know for certain whether the sailors Arganthonios welcomed so warmly ever fully understood the kingdom they were trading with, or whether the king who reportedly offered his own gold to help fortify a Greek city on the other side of the Mediterranean ever imagined that his own kingdom's name would eventually blur into legend, biblical rumor, and one archaeologist's mistaken search for Atlantis. What we do know is that the excavations are still active, that new seasons at Casas del Turuñuelo keep opening sealed pits nobody has looked inside in 2,500 years, and that every one of them has, so far, had something left to say. Somewhere under the soft, silted ground of the Guadalquivir Valley and the Extremaduran hills, there is very likely more of Tartessos still waiting, sealed under clay, sealed under centuries, in no particular hurry to be found. We don't know exactly what it will tell us when it finally is. But it has already told us more, in the last few years, than in the previous 2,000 combined, and it does not seem, yet, to be finished talking.